using PowerPoint. They take their Word document and they put it on it, which is really funny. You know, I guess it's good for blind people or people with impairment, visual impairment.
It's good for making people blind.
That's right. All right, let me just get the mic, because I hate to stand behind that stuff. So I'll get the mic, because I hate to stand.
Okay. Messieurs, dames. Okay. Thanks, everyone, for reconvening.
Thanks for your attention.
Thanks for your attention. Thanks for your Swiss punctuality. It's a tremendous it's a privilege to be able to end what has been a tremendously wonderful conference. I've really, I expected to love this conference, but not nearly so much. So I'm very grateful to all the contributors, and really want to say again a special thanks to Jurgis and all the local organizers, because all of us are here because of their hospitality. So maybe we could just open with a little thanks to them. That also includes Marta and several Signas and all the others, so I hope you take time to individually thank them for their help. Our game plan for this final session is very simple. We're going to talk about 3 topics. EDOUARD and I will each talk about those topics for 5 minutes consecutively, so and no more. So by that we should be finished in half an hour or less, and then we'll open it up. So given that it's the last session and we're not giving formal talks, we have the opportunity to just say outrageous things with little argumentation, and hopefully we'll offend everyone enough that we'll get a good discussion going to finish off the conference.
All right. Can you hear me? Yeah, good. So we'll start with grounding, right? It's a grounding question, which some talks were about. Now, one thing before I start, Jesse didn't quite tell the truth. So we didn't know what to do, and so we asked a few people in the audience. And so we did kind of a poll. And the best suggestion was to either dance or do some hip-hop. And so we decided to do neither, because, I mean, I'm a good dancer, but Jesse, yesterday night, no. So let's go for grounding. The issue here is about the role of action and perception in cognition. So that's a very vague way of putting the point, right? And now, I think what psychology has shown for about 10 years is that action or perceptual representations and motor representations are often used in tasks, in experimental tasks, that maybe 20, 30 years ago, people would have thought would involve a modal representations. So I think we've learned at least that much. And it's very clear from Rob's talk, also from Diane's talk, that we've learned that. So still an empirical question is how many of these tasks recruit or use perceptual and motor representations. Now that's the first question, and I don't want to disagree with any of that. Now there's another question which some philosophers like Jesse and also some psychologists, maybe Barsalou, have been also interested in, and the following question is, when you token a concept, when you entertain a concept, are you tokening exclusively perceptual and motor representations, right? Is to entertain a concept, to have in mind some perceptual representations and or some motor representations, right? It's a different claim, it's a much stronger claim, and at least I think that's a claim that Jesse has made. In some reading, Barsalou has also made this claim. It's a little bit unclear for psychologists because they talk about grounding and they leave the notion of grounding fairly unspecified and fairly vague. So it's a little bit unclear what their commitments about that question really are. Now, some people believe that there's a lot of evidence that for many concepts, really to token such a concept, to token a concept really amounts to entertaining perceptual and motor representations. And to manipulate a concept just is to manipulate these representations. Now, I think that's a very mistaken view. I mean, as I said yesterday, I believe, I'm by and large a Cartesian about many questions. And I think that many concepts anyway, not maybe all concepts, but many concepts are amodal representations. And so what I want to do today is just give you the 4 places, if you were interested, the 4 places where you could look, you could find evidence for that view, right? The idea that to have a concept is to have a representation that is neither perceptual nor a motor representation. Right? So there are 4 reasons, at least, to believe in that view. The first one comes from Descartes. You know, the idea is that we are able to grasp abstract concepts, and there are some work among some psychologists to try to explain how abstract concepts could be instantiated in perceptual representations. But Diane Pescher has actually done some very interesting work on the question, but I find this work overall fairly overwhelming, and I'm still convinced by Descartes' argument. Underwhelming, I guess that's what I wanted to say. The second place where you'll find good evidence for amodal concepts is when the kind of task where you are asked to assess a number of objects in an image. So you're seeing a number of dots, and you have to say, oh, there are 7 dots, 15 dots, 20 dots. Or you're given a sequence of sounds, and you have to say, oh, there were about 5 sounds. You cannot count, right? You don't have the time, but you're supposed to get an approximate estimation of the number of dots or of sounds in a sequence. Now, what you find if you look at this very large body of research is that in the visual case and in the auditory case, you find the same phenomena, right? So the auditory case and the visual case obey exactly the same psychophysical law. That's the first thing you find. You also find the same developmental trajectory. So assessment of the number of objects in the visual case and in the auditory case follows the same trajectory in children. And the third thing you find is also the lack of switching costs. As Diane mentioned yesterday, one good piece of evidence for the use of perceptual representations in experimental tasks is switching cost. When you move from one modality to the other, people are slower than when the 2 stimuli are in the same modality. In the case of the estimation of magnitude, there is no switching cost. I think that gives us very strong evidence for the idea that at least the representations of magnitude, of number, just is amodal. So that's a piece of evidence number 2. Piece of evidence number 1, abstract concept. Piece of evidence number 2, the assessment of magnitude. Piece of evidence number 3, some evidence from cognitive neuroscience, right? So brain imagery. Now, there are all these studies that show that if you want to convince people, you have to show them pictures of the brain. Sadly, I don't have PowerPoint, so I can't really show you a picture of the brain, but I'll talk about the brain, and maybe that will be enough. So if you do neuroimagery about belief ascription, right, which presumably involves tokening the concept of a belief, right, what you find is activation of the same brain area in the case of the presentation of images, visual stimuli, or in the case of the use of auditory stimuli, right? So the part of the brain which seem to be involved in belief ascription seem to be exactly the same, right? And there are also a bunch of other concepts for which the modality which is used to access concepts just doesn't matter, right? And I think that's, again, good evidence that the concept of a belief is an amodal concept. Again, it's an abstract concept, so I'm not very surprised by this finding. And the last type of evidence I'd like to mention comes from neuropsychology. Now, there's a lot of work in neuropsychology that fits very well with the view that concepts are amodal. I'll give you only 2 examples for the sake of time. The first one is a research on autism. So autism, when you look at children who have issues with ascribing beliefs to other people, you find that the modality of the stimuli just doesn't matter, right? It's not a problem with, it has no connection whatsoever with a modality issue. That's one piece of evidence, but a stronger piece of evidence comes from the research on semantic dementia. So that's a horrible brain disease, and which manifests itself by a degenerescence of the temporal lobes, starting with the temporal pole. It's horrible, and one manifestation is the loss of concepts, right? You're slowly losing your concepts. Now, you could have two patterns, right? You could make two distinct predictions. If you believe that to token a concept is to token a perceptual and or motor representation, you should predict the following pattern of concept loss. Domain general, modality specific loss of concept. Meaning you should lose concept modality by modality, right? You should lose your capacity to think about the auditory aspects of animals, and then your capacity to think about the visual aspects of animals. And you should lose these capacities one by one in a domain general manner. Now, if you're an amodal theorist like me, you make the opposite prediction. You should expect a domain-specific but modality general loss of concepts, right? So modality should not matter at all for losing concepts. By contrast, you should expect a loss of concept which cut across, which is a specialized domain by domain. People should lose concepts of animals, then maybe concepts of artifacts, and so on and so forth. And what you find when you look at the literature about semantic dementia is the second pattern, the one which is predicted by the view that concepts are amodal. So what we have here is four types of evidence: abstract concepts, behavioral evidence about the assessment of magnitude. We have evidence from cognitive neuroscience about the location of the realizers of some concepts, and we have some striking evidence from neuropsychology, particularly the work on semantic dementia. I think all that gives us a reason to believe that at least some concepts, and maybe many of them, are actually amodal representations and not modal representations.
Thanks. Maybe I'll use this one just so you can tell us apart. When I first started thinking about perceptual grounding, I was in graduate school, and I was very lucky to meet Larry Barcelow in my psychology department, and he and I both had this view that maybe the mind is a kind of perception machine. Maybe the evolution of cognition involves moving from a machine that uses perception and motor response, basically an input-output machine, to a machine that has inputs, outputs, and memory, some capacity to take these perceptual and motor states offline and use them for planning and decision-making. Our thought was that all of cognition might be grounded in representations that have a source in perception and cognition. At the time, there was very little evidence for the view. Lots of evidence has accumulated, some of the best coming from Diana Pacher here in our conference. But the evidence remains limited, and I think it's something like a working hypothesis. At the level of grand theory, however, I think it's no longer a working hypothesis, but one that's become very mainstream. And what I mean by that is, even if there are some exceptions of the kind that EDOUARD mentioned, we have moved beyond a view of the mind that was very, very popular before the grounding revolution took place. And that was a view that said we think largely, almost exclusively in an abstract code. Anatomically, the idea is that cognition is in the front of the brain, perception is in the back of the brain, and if you're going to perform a cognitive task, re-engagement of the senses would not be how you would do it. The language of thought hypothesis was a dominant view in cognitive science. I think people, especially in cognitive neuroscience, but in other areas of cognitive science, no longer take that view especially seriously. There are people who do, of course, many in this room, but it's no longer just the orthodoxy in cognitive science to think amodal code is the major workhorse in cognition. Instead, we see constant and pervasive re-engagement of the senses while performing cognitive tasks, including tasks in very abstract domains. It would take some time to go through EDOUARD's 4 examples in any detail, so let me try to be brief. With respect to the kind of Cartesian abstraction examples, we'd have to go case by case. But if you take something like Descartes' example of the Chileagon, a 100-sided figure, which is very difficult to image, to form a mental image of, we certainly know how to construct one. We know how to test an image to see whether it is 100-sided. and we know how to do that with our senses. So I think there's a sense in which we do acquire the ability to think very abstractly using a certain kind of amodal symbol system called language. So you can think of a kind of virtual rationalism. The acquisition of spoken languages allows us to encode a very complex idea that we couldn't grasp in a single sensory gestalt with a single word. So the word chalagon is a wonderful shorthand for something that we actually couldn't sense all at once. But to understand the word chalagon, I think we would need to apply it to an actual visual case. So that word is grounded in the perceptual or perceptual motor ability. With respect to math cognition, that's a big topic, and it's not a single domain. There are probably many factors that lead to mathematical cognition. Some of these subitizing results or estimation results might involve multi-object attention capacities, where there's a sense in which attention is supramodal, but attention can't work without some modality-specific representation. So maybe one of our ways to estimate numbers is to sort of see how many attentional pointers are deployed for a given stimulus, and that attentional pointing strategy might carry across modalities, but the representations used in each case will be modality specific. Much more to say about that topic, but I'll leave it at that for time. The third one was about representation of belief. So Eduard and I have discussed this case in print, so I won't belabor it here in a symposium on Eduard's wonderful book on concepts. But I will say that the area that's been put forward as the basis of mental state attribution is the temporal parietal juncture, and this is work by Rebecca Sachs and her collaborators. The problem is there's no theory in that literature of exactly what this structure is doing in these tasks. And if you look independently, just do a meta-analysis of what interparietal juncture is good at, in addition to being connected to various language areas, which may be very important for mental state attribution, it's also a major intersensory coordination hub. So the idea that you get convergent capacity for mental state attribution across the senses would actually predict that an intersensory coordination structure may be importantly involved. It's also used for task switching. So if you imagine attributing a belief to someone, you need to sort of hold your beliefs in check. You need to bracket them off while simulating or attributing a belief to someone else. So the interparietal juncture, so temporal parietal juncture may again play a role like that. Until we know what role it's playing, the conclusion that it's an amodal representation of mental states is, I think, a big leap. And finally, with respect to semantic dementia, I reject the claim that it's a prediction of the modality-specific account that we'll always get modality-specific deficits with our category disorders rather than category deficits that affect multiple modalities. Now, indeed, you can get a kind of modality-specific category disorder, but the fact that we find some people who lose categorical knowledge that affects multiple modalities simply reveals an interesting fact about storage of information in a kind of geographic way. We learned that the brain is able to retain information about multiple sensory features in anatomically localized areas. But it's been a feature of it's been a central claim of the neo-empiricist program that something like convergence zones exist in the brain, that there are brain structures that play a role in doing something like the bookkeeping that allows for some kind of coordination between the senses. So if you say, give me a word, like the word dog, I need to somehow reactivate all of these sensory-specific features, like the texture of the fur and the sound it makes and its appearance. And it may just be that the way this is done is through something is in a certain way like an amodal symbol. It's a node in a network that serves to reactivate all these others. But if you say, can I token the dog concept? Can I bring the dog concept to mind by just tokening that node? There's no evidence for that. The node itself is inert with respect to cognitive performance. Any decision or thinking we make about the dog may involve the reactivation of the senses that are linked to that node. So these functional units are not amodal representations, they're coordination hubs. And to the extent that that's been part of the picture, part of the architecture proposed by neo-empiricists, the presence of these category disorders is not decisive evidence for amodality. I think there will be cases. I mean, I don't want to be overly zealous in my empiricism. Well, I do, but I certainly don't want it to become a debate about can we find some isolated and special case where the brain has ended up with a representation that's in some sense transmodal. Maybe it has. So I think keeping this at the level of grand theory of how the mind works, the empiricist program went from being a completely insane conjecture to being something like one of the orthodox views. And that's a consequence of a tremendously powerful research program that people like Diana have been involved in. Next, I start the next one. So our next topic is modularity, which was remarked by Stephen is not a new topic for the conference. So modularity has come back into vogue. This is a confession. I cannot begin to understand the motivation for modularity. For me, it's a silly hypothesis, the major argument in the literature for which is the Mueller-Lyer illusion. And this to me strikes me as absurd. The idea that the major piece of evidence for this theory is one illusion. So I'm going to debunk that right now for you. So here's a parity argument. So if I had a Mueller-Lyer illusion, and I tried to hold the two lines with my fingers, open my finger aperture to the exact length of the two lines, using touch, the illusion would not go away. So I've just proven that the illusion is robust. The illusion is not affected by other modalities, that touch is not affecting the illusion. The structure of argument you find in Fodor would lead to a single conclusion at this point. Vision is modular with respect to touch. That's the inference he would draw. That inference is false. It's demonstrably false. So for example, there's a huge literature showing effects of transfer from touch to vision. You can give somebody a binocular rivalry paradigm and have them hold on to features that look like the ones in the two eyes, and the feature they're touching will affect which feature they see. You can give somebody a moving grid, a tactile grid that's moving in a certain direction. It will produce a motion after effect. So there's lots of crosstalk between the senses, and there needs to be, and we know that well, and it includes tactician to vision. So we certainly shouldn't infer from the fact that tactician can't affect the Mueller-Lyer illusion that tactician can't get into vision. We know it can. What's going on here, what's flawed about this inference, is the fact that there's sometimes an overriding of vision over cognition does in no way prove that cognition can't get into vision. It just proves that it can't always get in. Imagine you're building a brain, you're building a mind. How do you want it to work? Well, you certainly want to safeguard against top-down effects that would simply overwrite or be radically inconsistent with the sensory input. What you want to allow in is information that would help resolve ambiguities, information that would draw on past knowledge, information that would clarify a stimulus that might not be particularly precise. And that's exactly where we find these kinds of effects. And the effects are pervasive. I think that the kind of predictive account of vision that Andy talked about on the first day is a massive research program that show this. I think the stuff that Fiona talked about mental imagery, intermingling with perception, again, pervasive and important for ordinary perception, as Coslin showed many years ago, is another example. I think prediction, or Anya Ferenikova talked about perception of action, of absence. These are cases where we can sort of notice that something is gone, and this seems to involve some sort of template matching that goes from a prior belief or expectation into the visual modality. All these very, very common phenomena, I think, suggest that cognition is getting into vision all the time. But I want to mention one more example, which has, I think, been inadequately discussed in the literature, and this is a hat tip to Rob, because one of the phenomena that's absolutely well understood in psychology is categorical perception. And we know that both language and non-linguistic learning can lead to the creation of categorical boundaries within continuous domains. So the way we perceive the visual world is broken up into little bits into categories that are disjoint, and there are interesting and very predictable perceptual effects around the boundaries of those categories. So that if you have three items that are equally distant in sensory space, but not equally distant in category space, you'll perceive the two that are in the same category as more alike than the two that are in different categories. Very powerful effects, and I think they're a very clear case where category learning, concept acquisition, alters perception. And Rob has done some extremely interesting and important work on this, so I recommend people interested in modularity spend some time looking at that literature.
Good. So I don't have any specific view about the extent and nature of penetration, but I have some remarks to make about the debate. But before, let me just say a few things about what Jesse has said. I mean, he's just right about there's something quite strange to believe that one instance of lack of penetration shows that there's no cognitive penetration. That just seems to be a horrible argument. That said, it leaves open the interesting questions, which is how often, where, to which extent, what's the depth of cognitive penetration. So that could be, in a sense, a very Pyrrhic victory. It could be, well, yes, there's cognitive penetration. It's extremely shallow. It does not, it's extremely uncommon. So I think there's a bunch of really interesting empirical questions about the nature and the extent and the depth of penetration. What I want to say about penetration is, I don't know how many of you know that, but I work in, at Pitt, we've got 2 philosophy departments, which is cool in a way. We've got the philosophy department and we've got history and philosophy of science where I work. And so some of my colleagues do a lot of history of science, and I guess they've influenced me a little bit over the years. And so I've paid attention to history of science as a way to think about various issues. And in the case of penetration, it's really interesting to look at what happened to the New Look in the 1950s, 1960s, and why the New Look died. People just came to the conclusion that, well, all this research program was a mess and had to be rejected. Try to understand the causes that led to the dismissal of this research project, and look at whether the New Look, which is what we have now both in psychology and in philosophy, does not suffer from exactly the same problems. In fact, I think that's what I want to say. I just want to express some concerns about the New Look, and exactly for that reason, that the issues that led to the dismissal of the New Look actually are still with us in the modern research in psychology about penetration. I just mentioned 3 issues for the sake of time. One of them, when you look at the New Look research, one of the main issues people just kept working on was the location problem. So there is penetration, but penetration of what? Right? Where does penetration happen? Is that in attention? Is that on beliefs, on judgments? At which stage? And people just, at the time, if you look in the 1960s, they used various sophisticated ways to deal with this question, like signal detection theory was used extensively to try to understand where penetration was taking place. But what happened is that even SDT, people came to the conclusion that even that way of trying to answer that question wasn't successful. Right? And so people just, one of the reasons why people stopped working at the time is because they didn't find any nice way of answering the question, where does penetration take place? Is that an effect on attention, on which form of attention, on judgment? And my reading of some of the literature nowadays, mostly in psychology, is that the location problem hasn't been solved at all. And many experiments are actually, I think, god-awful because they just ignore. I won't give names here. I've got a paper where I give names of people whose work I think is horrible because they just ignore the location problem. Okay, that's one issue. A second issue was horrible experiments. If you look at the 1950s, 1960s, there's a range of experiments that are god-awful. Here's the kind of experiment you find. It's a Delk and Phelan-Baum, which has been cited here, actually, by Fiona. So if you've read that 7-page paper, it's a really short read, you've learned that they didn't see the cutouts directly. They see the cutouts through a waxed paper. Not only do they see the cutouts through a waxed paper, so you can barely see the color. Not only that, it's in a dim light. So they close the light, they prevent light to come in. Basically, they put subjects in a situation where they can barely see the stimulus they have to make a decision about. Not only that, they're not the one who are making the feed between the two colors. The psychologist is the one who are. What conclusion can we draw from that horrible experiment? The conclusion is nothing. It's just a complete mess. There's also tons of research in the 1950s, 1960s about demand characteristics. The fact that many of the results in the new look were due to the psychologist suggesting the expected result. Now, in the new look, as you may know, there's tons of research that suggests that the well-known results about the backpack by Profit and colleagues are all due to demand characteristics. So there's some fantastic papers. There's a guy, a psychologist whose name I'm forgetting now, who seems to be making a career in...
Frank Durgan at Swarthmore.
Exactly, that guy. He's got a bunch of fantastic papers where he just shows that many of the results are just demand characteristics. So it's basically artifacts of the experimental situation. The same issue, demand characteristics are one of the issues that killed the new look in the 1960s. And my suspicion is that it's going to kill the new look within a few years. And also, we talked a bit about the Banerjee during the conference, and David here gave fantastic talks about all the issues with Banerjee's experiment. If you look at her first experiment, it's a horrible experiment. She looks at two faces, one black, one white, and if you cut, the luminance are the same overall on the face, but if you just look at the bottom of the image of the face, you see the luminance is not equally distributed on the bottom of the face, which of course, if you pay attention to different places of a face, right, you're going to come with different judgments about the color of the skin, for those of you who know that experiment. So so the first issue was the location problem. Second issue was issues with experimental design. The third issue is lack of replication. If you look in the 1950s, 1960s, these experiments that people were talking about, philosophers like Kuhn and other people, these experiments failed to replicate again and again. So one time they were in, 10 times they were out. It was just a complete mess. Delk and Philenbaum is actually part of a series of experiments. The first two experiments were unsuccessful. Now, lack of replication is due to many factors, right? It can be due to just bad experimenters. But still, I think it was one of the reasons why people lost faith in the new look back then. Now, if you look at what's going on nowadays, lack of replication is endemic to the new look, right? There's plenty of studies that do not replicate, that replicate only in some circumstances, and so on and so forth. So what we have is the three issues that led to the rejection of the new look are present with us in the new look. So does that mean there has not been any progress? There are better experiments now, some of them about the perception of color, which I think are actually much better than everything that has been done so far, and that actually are maybe some evidence of penetration. But as a philosopher, I'd like philosophers to be slightly, and as a historian and philosopher of science, I'd like philosophers to be slightly more cautious in the way they're dealing with experimental evidence, because it's often quite messy and unsatisfactory. Yeah, I'm the next one to start again. All right, good. I like having the mic anyway, so we'll do, the last one is about realism. And I don't have that much to say about realism anyway, so I don't do metaphysics at all. And what I'm really interested in is epistemology, is how to justify scientific beliefs, what scientific theories to have. That's really what excites me. Metaphysics, not much less. But I just want to make a small point about there's interesting idea that we've been treating colors in a specific way, and maybe we should treat space in the same way, which I think is actually very insightful about what we should do when some folk notions reveal to be incompatible, some folk notions which are part of our lay image of the world reveal to be at odds with the scientific image of the world. And I think it's a very nice way of dealing with that very important problem, actually, that anybody interested in the interaction between the lay image and the scientific image should be concerned with. Now, there's a color case, and I think that's actually a really nice case to think about. I didn't look, but what I would invite us to do is to look for cases where we went the other way, right? For cases where we didn't functionalize concepts and decide that the concept was about whatever, what satisfying the functional definition, right? And there must be plenty of cases like that in the history of science. Now, one question is, why did we do that for some notions, and why not for other notions, right? Why did we decide that there are colors, right? But why didn't we decide that there are no X, where X is, I don't know what, because I haven't found yet a good example, but I just started to think about it 3 minutes ago. So I'm sure, I hope I'll find one. But if I find one, of course, the next question is not an objection to that. The next question is, well, what would be the differences between the cases, right? Why would we have gone one way for the case of color, maybe space, and why would we go another way for other cases? And, you know, I think that's an interesting research program, maybe an interesting philosophical question. I don't have much more to say about that, so if some of you have ideas, you can give them to me.
Okay. Oh, right. I used the other one.
Yep.
I'm not as young as EDOUARD, so I can't move quite so much. I've come to think that analytic philosophy rests on a mistake, and that all of us in philosophy of mind are heirs to that mistake. And the mistake has a word, and the word is reference. And it's not an original complaint, but let me give you briefly my version of it. I think there are several myths that have entered into our thinking, and one of them is that our concepts have precise reference. That is, they're well defined for the class of possible things. You can do the sort and just say this one's in the category, this one's not, and you can do that not just for core cases, but around the edges. Another component of the myth is that these precise boundaries are given not by the mind, not by decisions we make, but by the world. They're given to us metaphysically. And a third part of the picture is that somehow this fact, these metaphysically given categories, are important for doing psychology. I don't think any of these facts are true. And I'm standing here with Ruth on one side and Michael Devitt on the other, so I'm saying this with a little bit of a shake, and that might just be, I haven't had a drink today. Here's the thing. If you listen to, say Dave, who's given us a post-Edenic psychosemantics for how to think about the world after the fall, we get a very one might say anthropocentric semantics, a semantics where categories depend very much on us. And I think you see that picture in some of the work on color that Kathleen presented. Alva, is Alva here? Did Alva leave? Oh, good, we can say anything. So Alva used the word inactive perception, and he dropped using it. And he dropped using it because all these disciples of Francisco Varela said he was using it incorrectly. And I think that's a shame, because I don't like his version of it, but I actually like the Varela version of it. And I say this by way of confession. So for Varela, to enact is to bring something into existence, to bring something forth. And as sort of awfully metaphorical as that sounds, I think it's useful to think about minds as things that inhabit a world, a real world with real clumps, and we get by not by sort of pointing to one element of the clump and then somehow magically throwing a lasso around an essence. We get by getting enough generalizations about the clumps that we know what to do when we encounter other very similar members of the clump. But there are going to be lots of cases for which we don't know what to do on the basis of those previous encounters, because they're going to be pushing towards the boundaries. Those are choice points. So I think this idea that the categories with which we interact are somehow constructed in these decisional moments where we make a decision, not a discovery, about some borderline member going into the category or not, suggests that the realist picture described by that characterization of the reference dogma, three-part reference dogma, is no longer tenable. What is tenable is something that I think is a reconciliation between a kind of realism and a kind of response-dependent view. So for those who were jarred at the seeming contrast between Ruth and Dave, I think actually there's room here for a kind of consilience, which is to say Ruth's metaphysics is actually radical in that it departs from a certain view of realism that I think we got from people like Saul Kripke. It's this clumpy, cloddy thing that's sort of about the core and not about the periphery. So if we think about this idea that when we are dealing with kinds out there in the world, all these constructions, from the obvious constructions like the physical buildings around us to the less obvious constructions like the categories of biology, the idea that there's a human decisional process in articulating the boundaries, I think, leads to a picture where it's not that there is no given world, it's that that's not the world we inhabit, or rather the world we inhabit is one that selects from umpteen many possible givens. And that selectional process suggests that if we're to do a semantics for psychology, it shouldn't be the semantics of essentialism and reference, it should be the semantics of decision. We'll stop there. We've said lots of things to offend you all, I hope. So now the floor is open. We're going to try and end this within 15 minutes or so. But any topic from the course of the whole conference is fair game. Oh, right. You have the microphone, huh? Yeah.
I understand what the debate about cognitive penetrability of perception transforms into for a new empiricist. So when new empiricists say things like there is massive cognitive penetrability of vision, they don't really mean that. They mean there is massive perceptual penetration of perception. So you've basically explained those cases by online percepts being penetrated by offline representations, and there's an overriding operation. In the cases of impenetrability, like the Miller-Lyer case. And I was just wondering if you need an additional resource to explain those cases. So in addition to memory mechanisms and online percepts, do you think you need predictive states or perceptual expectations, or do you think everything can be handled by memory mechanisms? So that's just a question for you.
When I talk about the pervasiveness of penetration, I think it's kind of penetration everywhere from all directions, which is to say, when you have an evolved organism that's in the business of trying to get through its day, background knowledge of any kind, however it's been stored. As an empiricist, I don't think there's a radical divide between perceptual information and conceptual information. The divide really has much more to do with the nature of the storage. So concepts are just well stored and very usable, very actionable perceptual records. So if you say, is it just within the modules? Is it just perception penetrating perception? I would say, of course, there's nothing else but perception. But if you say, is there sort of a greater tendency to the non-actionable perceptual units to interact with incoming inputs than the actionable ones? I would say, no, there's no particular reason to think that's true. I don't know if on memory, I don't know if this will answer the question. I guess I think it's all in some sense, all violations of modularity are in some sense memory issues. But how this memory works, I'm inclined to endorse Fiona. Is Fiona here? Okay, Fiona's here. I'm inclined to endorse Fiona's view that memory characteristically interacts with perception via something like mental imagery. So I think any account of sort of expectation or of that kind would just be a special case where memory has caused an image. Is that?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you want to dissociate perceptual expectations from memory. So it's not just a special uptake of memory, it's maybe a distinct state, or it's something that uses memory or taps into memory, but you don't want to subsume perceptual expectations under memory because it's functionally has a different job. Memory stores information, manipulates information, whereas perceptual expectations predict things. They use memory, but their functional description is different. Yeah, so it seems like you need a third resource.
Also, memory itself is not a natural kind. So in a way, the whole idea of memory is just a very, very superordinate category term for any kind of retention of information. So to say expectation is a form of memory is not to say it's subsumed under some sort of mechanism in the mind that's involved in all other forms of memory. It's just to say all these cases involve retention.
Yeah, thank Thank you. My question is more general about this second topic that you raised. So you called it modularity. And then Jesse talked about kind of rejecting that view, and I'm very sympathetic to what she said. But then when Edward started talking, he started saying, what are the problems with penetration? And then I wondered, okay, well, that's not really then a counter, it's not really a proof to modularity either. So I guess my kind of big broad question is, it seems like there are these two pictures we're working with, as I understood from this conference. Here's perception, here's cognition, and we either have this big-ass boundary in the middle, and that's the modularity, or one penetrates the other. But what if these two pictures are somewhat wrong, because these two things are really much more closer to each other than we think? And there was one talk that I was inspired by Jacob Beck, who was exactly discussing this boundary between perception and cognition. So maybe if we could talk more about that, I would like to hear more opinions.
You want Jacob to chime in on that one?
Sorry? Well, I don't know, anybody.
I mean, I can just agree on I can just say make a small point. I mean, it is true that the debate seems to be, and I think Stephen made the same point, partly, I mean, there's an issue about exactly what the notions at play are and exactly how to define them. And so Stephen made the point about attention, exactly what if penetration should exclude cases where beliefs influence perception via attention, and if we don't have a clear understanding or clear characterization of what this pathway would be, it seems the debate is right now very hard to decide. And of course, there's the same issue about cognition and perception. I mean, one idea I think would be maybe to look at paradigmatic cases, try forget about the definition, and just look at whether some cases of things which are clearly conceptual beliefs have some influence on things which are clearly low-level perception. That would be actually maybe one way to make progress without having to sort out the quite tricky issue of definitions.
Yeah, so Edward, I think we need to talk about abstract concepts.
Do we?
I think so. Yeah, I think it would be really interesting. And I think what is interesting about this whole grounded cognition movement is that people are trying to see how far you can get just using sensory motor representations. But of course, there is some abstraction. We know that people abstract, and so one idea that I think might be really fruitful is to look at these exemplar models that were developed in the 80s for memory and categorization, where these models assume that you store in memory exemplars of your experiences. And I mean, these models are silent about the nature of these exemplars, but I think they could be sensory motor representations. And then at the moment when you need to use a concept, then you sort of retrieve the exemplars that are, that are useful at that moment, and actually your representation is some kind of summary or abstraction from all those exemplars. And in that sense, I think you could have a representation that is more or less sensory motor or more or less abstract, but they're still grounded in the sensory motor exemplars. And I think that might be really an interesting approach to see how far we can get with those models.
I agree.
I didn't actually have a question. I'm a mistake.
That's a habit,
It's a question for Jesse. I want to try and make attentional pointers much more important, much more like amodal symbols than just mere organizational structures, as you call them. And it's just to kind of develop an argument of Jeff Ellman and Andy Clark that words are attentional, well, words are cues to bodies of knowledge. Cues are attentional pointers. And by the same token, internal pointers to bodies of knowledge need a syntax and need to be ordered correctly to distinguish between, say, Boris hunting the fat gnu and the fat gnu hunting Boris. You need attentional pointers to the right bodies of knowledge in a syntactic order. And that amounts to amodal symbol manipulation.
Good. Yeah, I mean, we might need to talk more. I do think one certainly wants to grant that there are all kinds of operations of the mind, and those operations are in some sense not in a modality. I mean, if you take memory itself, of course, it's an operation in the mind. It's not a perceptual symbol. But of course, no one would be inclined to say, well, therefore, there's an amodal symbol, namely memory. So then a question becomes, how should we think about these attentional pointers? Should we think about them as more like symbols, or more like operations that make use of symbols? And here's exactly where the details of the model would start to become very important. I do think, I mean, in language there are striking things. So for example, you can show some degree of insensitivity to the input modality. So a spoken word and a grapheme will converge to some extent on how they're represented. So with respect to the role of attention in language processing, there may be some tendency to see it operating on a code that looks like it's somehow bimodal or indifferent to input modalities in ways that are suggestive of amodality. I am attracted to the picture that we have this great problem of continuity, which is we have these creatures in the world that are so similar to us biologically, but they're not wearing clothing and they don't have the internet. And that's really an extraordinary fact that we need to explain. And I think one very appealing way to make some progress on that question, and I think a big part of the answer is memory, but another big part of the story may be that we've acquired this ability to represent and think about the world through language and other symbol systems that allow for retention of information, moving around very complex ideas very simply, and maybe even thinking amodally in some literal or figurative sense. So I do think that's a very good place to be looking for the way in which we go beyond our empiricist inheritance. Let's give the mic to Mike.
Thanks. Well, I probably should resist your provocation here, but I'm not going to. I've come to the defense of the real world and reference. First of all, I think it's a total red herring, all this stuff about sharp boundaries and kinds and so on. So I don't know who ever believed it. I know it's common in psychology and the movement in psychology about concepts to suppose there was a classical theory according to which there were sharp, necessary and sufficient conditions for membership and reference and so on. But I don't think this is true, but even if it were true, it's accidental. That is to say, the sort of view that you seem to be against should be one that accepts all sort of indeterminacy of kinds and, of course, therefore indeterminacy of reference. But the really shocking bit was the bit at the end about decision. There is a freedom we have and a freedom we don't have here. Let's speak a little bit loosely. There's just an indefinitely large number of kinds out there in the world because there are everything is similar to everything else in some respect, and everything is different from everything else in some respect. So the question is, which kinds are we going to focus on and name? That's a decision we make, right? But once we've made the decision, then it's a matter of fact, subject to some indeterminacy at the edges. It's a matter of fact, independent of us and our decision, what is a member of the kind and what our term refers to.
Good.
That's my missionary work.
In a way, what I want to do is I want to accept that, but I want to push for decision going much deeper than we might have thought. So, you know, if you think just about something as simple as Barbara Malt's example of tea not being water. So you ask people, is tea water? And people say, no, it's not. And there's a very straightforward thing we can say about that, which is that, well, what people really mean by that is it's not entirely water, but it's mostly water. But I think there's a way in which when we, and this is why the boundaries sort of matter a bit, there's a way in which it's also a decision which kind of classification we're doing. Are we treating it as a chemical kind? Are we treating it as a functional kind? What level of nature matters to us? And I don't think that there's a plausible account of how prior to the advent of some branch of science like modern chemistry, we can succeed in referring to microstructure. So if you ask, you know, the classic Putnamian, what did we refer to in pre-1750 when we pointed to this stuff in lakes and oceans, I don't think a good story has been told about how we managed to refer to microstructure there. So is it a discovery? Well, no. When we actually go to the sample and do the science to figure out what we've been referring to all this time, I think that process should be thought of more as a decisional process. When we do the science, actually what we're doing is we're taking a sample of some stuff that we're talking about, but we haven't yet made any decision whatsoever. Well, there are constraints, but we haven't made a decisive decision about which level of organization is the one that we're now going to, as a matter of policy, pursue. Yeah, so I can see from the facial expression you disagree with this, but yeah, that's where I think the discussion will go. It's a minority position. I know there's a question from Fiona.
So I would like to be provoked by EDOUARD because I just think that I don't know of any modern philosophers who rest their case for cognitive penetration on the Delk and Phillenbaum experiments alone. So it feels kind of weird to be ticked off, or philosophers should know better than to rely on or discuss such experiments. The Delk and Phillenbaum experiment case is really interesting because it has many features that overcome objections that have been cited to other cases. And the Delk and Phillenbaum, I thought, you know, their experiment, thinking of it in particular, I thought you were really rather unfair to it. So it's true that it's part of a series of experiments. It was the third experiment after two. It wasn't that the effect wasn't found in those others, the first two experiments. The effect was found. It was just that there was worries about that there was two confounds in those other experiments, and this was a refinement of that methodology to avoid those two confounds. It's not true that the experiment was done in the dark or in darkened conditions. The experiment was performed using a light box to ensure even illumination, which seems like the right thing to do. It's true that the experimenter moved the background in response to the subject's instructions, but if you know about the history of how they used the equipment that they had to make adjustable backgrounds, you would understand that that's completely reasonable given the equipment that they were using. It's true that they did use wax paper over the front of the box, but that didn't stop the subjects accurately matching the background in the case of of objects that didn't have a characteristic colour. So to think that that sort of obscured view in an important way really needs to be thought more carefully about. And moreover, a lot of philosophers cite modern, elegant experiments. For example, the case I rest on is the face race case by Levin and Banerjee, two top Harvard psychologists who thought very carefully about confounds. And people are also citing modern experiments done by Hansen and a bunch of other people. So I think you're a little bit unfair on Delk and Phillenbaum and the modern arguments for cognitive penetration.
This will be our final question, by the way, but a very good one to end on.
So I picked up on Delk and Phillenbaum just because you used it, but I think the issues I mentioned actually were widespread in the literature of the time. There was actually massive debates about issues with experimental design in the new look. There were massive debates about the location problem. There's tons of articles in Psych Review at the time that debate about problems with tons of studies in the new look. So I just picked up on one example. But the problems I just mentioned were widely recognized at the time to be endemic in the whole literature, and that's actually the reason why just people stopped believing in that, right? So you know, we can debate about Delk and Fluenbaum. I agree that your response about the accuracy of the assessment in the just geometrical cutout is actually a persuasive one. But I think it would be a mistake to just ignore that there was a massive debate about the quality of his experimental work just at the time. And the same debate is actually starting to happen about the new look. I mean, I think nobody can ignore that fact. But also, I also said, and I agree about Hanson, that's his name, right? Which I think is actually one of the best studies, in fact, that seems to actually be moving forward the experimental work on penetration. So the claim was not that I didn't deny penetration. I didn't deny there's no evidence. What I asserted is that some issues that led to the dismissal of the new look psychology seem to be with us nowadays, and I think it's quite important to actually highlight these issues. Yeah.
So, on that note, I'm afraid we have to bring the conference to a close, or not quite a close, because there's a dinner tonight, which I hope all of you are attending. And now I think there's some opportunity to see some art. Is that right, Jurgis? Do you want to make any announcements about? Okay, so thank you all.
Thank you. So I have a couple of last announcements. First of all, thanks a lot for the wonderful talks, for amazing conference. Thank you so much. That's a huge talk to all of you. And especially to Edouard and Jess for doing all this amazing work possible. So thanks a lot. Thank you. And I'd also like to thank local helpers and organizers, to Christina, to both Leavus, to Three Cygnus. We have, lots of wonderful Latvian helpers. Krista and Marta, who has done really amazing work in doing all this event possible. Thanks. And of course, I hope to see you sometime in Riga again. And so if you are traveling and if you are planning to be in the Baltic area, drop a message and I'll be happy to see you in Riga again. Okay, so the final today's event is our conference dinner, which will take place in restaurant Cultivati, which is 5 minutes walking distance from here, but what we will do, we will pick you up at Hotel Conventa Sata 7:15. So 7:15 we will pick you up at Hotel Conventa Sata. Those of you who do not know where is Hotel Conventa Sata, we will make a meeting point in front of National Opera. That's the white building across the park. Okay, actually it's not difficult to find. I mean, if you ask somebody on the street where is Cultivati, everybody will help you. I mean, that's perhaps one of the most popular restaurants in Riga. So, well, one final announcement for those of you who are departing tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll have a Riga Marathon, which means that there will be traffic restrictions and it might be a bit jammy, so I would recommend to take additional 45 minutes into account. So, thanks a lot. See you later.